The autumn sun filtered through the golden leaves as Margaret, a 65-year-old black woman, wheeled herself down a quiet country road. She enjoyed the crisp morning air, the way the world seemed calm and unhurried. But halfway through her stroll, her breathing grew labored, her chest tightening as the familiar signs of an asthma attack crept in. Margaret quickly fumbled with her bag, searching for her inhaler. Her trembling hands betrayed her urgency, spilling the bag's contents onto the ground. The inhaler rolled a few feet away, just beyond her reach. Panic set in as her vision blurred, her breath escaping in short, sharp gasps. Desperately, she leaned forward, her frail body stretching toward the inhaler. Suddenly, a shadow loomed over her. She looked up to see Brian, a tall, middle-aged white police officer. Relief washed over her face for a brief moment. Surely, he would help her in her time of need. But Brian's expression was cold. He picked up the inhaler, examining it with a sneer. "What's this? Another junkie tool?" he said mockingly. Without hesitation, he tossed the inhaler into a nearby trash can. Margaret gasped, her hand reaching out. "Please, I can't breathe," she managed to wheeze. Brian smirked, as if amused by her struggle. "You people are always so dramatic," he muttered before turning away, leaving her helpless on the roadside. Margaret tried to call out for help, but her voice was too weak. She struggled to move her wheelchair closer to the trash can, but lost her balance, tumbling onto the pavement. Tears streamed down her face as she clawed at the ground, her strength fading. Just as her vision began to darken, a voice called out, "Mom! Mom, I'm here!" It was Ethan, her 35-year-old son, rushing toward her with panic etched across his face. He scooped her up and found the discarded inhaler in the trash. Without wasting a second, he administered it to her. Margaret's breathing slowly stabilized, though her body remained weak. Ethan cradled her, his anger boiling beneath the surface. "Who did this to you?" he demanded. Between shallow breaths, Margaret whispered, "The officer. He threw it away." Ethan's jaw tightened as he looked up and saw the patrol car disappearing down the road. He memorized the license plate number before lifting his mother back into her wheelchair. "Let's get you to the hospital," he said, his voice trembling with both fear and fury. At the hospital, Margaret recovered quickly, thanks to Ethan's timely intervention. But the emotional scars of the incident ran deep. She recounted the officer's cruel actions to Ethan, who listened with clenched fists and a storm brewing in his eyes. "He left you to die," Ethan said, his voice low and dangerous. "That man doesn't deserve to wear a badge." Margaret tried to soothe him. "Ethan, we'll report him. We'll follow the law." And they did. Margaret and Ethan filed a formal complaint against Brian, detailing every cruel act he had committed. The case went to court, and for a brief moment, Margaret felt hope. But that hope was crushed when the court dismissed their case due to a lack of evidence. There were no cameras in the area, and Brian denied the allegations, claiming he was merely on patrol. The decision was a slap in the face. As Margaret and Ethan left the courtroom, Brian stood nearby, a smug grin on his face. "You people think you can put me in jail?" he sneered. "You have no rights here." Margaret's shoulders slumped as tears welled up in her eyes. Back at home, she wept openly, overwhelmed by the injustice. Ethan sat beside her, his hands resting on her frail shoulders. "Don't worry, Mom," he said softly. "I'll get justice for you." Margaret thought he was just trying to comfort her. She had no idea that Ethan's idea of justice would go far beyond the bounds of the law. The injustice lingered in Ethan's mind, gnawing at him like a relentless storm. Every time he looked at his mother, he saw the pain in her eyes and the exhaustion in her frail body. Margaret tried to move on, but Ethan couldn't let it go. The image of Officer Brian walking out of the courtroom with a smug grin haunted him. One afternoon, as Ethan sat in his modest apartment flipping through papers from the failed court case, a thought struck him like lightning. He knew Brian had a family. He had overheard it during the trial. A daughter. The man who had left his mother gasping for air had something to lose, someone he loved. The seed of a plan began to form in Ethan's mind. A week later, Ethan learned through casual inquiries at the school where he worked as a nurse that Brian's daughter, Sophie, was a student there. She was only 10 years old, a cheerful, bright-eyed girl who often chatted with the school staff. Ethan felt a pang of guilt when he saw her for the first time, her laughter echoing through the hallway. But the memory of his mother's tear-streaked face hardened his resolve. "They don't feel guilty for what they've done," Ethan whispered to himself. "Why should I?" Ethan spent the next few days preparing meticulously. Using his medical expertise, he created a toxin that would act slowly, causing symptoms of a severe illness without immediately raising alarm. He told himself that Sophie wouldn't die. The toxin would merely incapacitate her long enough to make Brian suffer, to make him understand the pain of watching a loved one in danger. One afternoon, Sophie came to the school infirmary with a mild cough. She was cheerful as always, chatting about her favorite class project. Ethan's hands trembled as he mixed her medicine, slipping the toxin into a small vial. As he handed it to her, he forced a smile. "This will help you feel better," he said. "Thanks, Mr. Ethan," Sophie chirped, taking the medicine without a second thought. Ethan watched her leave, his heart pounding. The first step was done. That evening, at Brian's home, Sophie began coughing again. At first, Brian thought it was just a cold, something minor that would pass. He gave her over-the-counter medicine and tucked her into bed. But as the night wore on, her condition worsened. She developed a fever, her small body trembling under the blankets. By morning, Sophie's cough had become violent, and blood speckled her pillow. Brian's heart sank as panic set in. He rushed her to the hospital, where the doctors ran numerous tests. Hours later, they returned with grim expressions. "We've never seen anything like this," one doctor admitted. "Her symptoms suggest poisoning, but we can't identify the toxin." Brian was stunned. Poison? How? His mind raced, trying to piece together how this could have happened. Sophie had only taken medicine from the school nurse, Ethan. The realization hit him like a freight train. Ethan. The next day, Brian stormed into the school, his face flushed with fury. He demanded to see Ethan, who was calmly going about his duties in the infirmary. When Brian burst through the door, Ethan barely looked surprised. "You poisoned my daughter!" Brian roared, grabbing Ethan by the collar and slamming him against the wall. "How could you? She's just a child." Ethan didn't flinch. His voice was cold, emotionless. "The same way you watched my mother gasp for air and did nothing. Now you'll feel what it's like to be powerless." Brian's grip tightened, his hands shaking with rage. "Tell me how to save her," he growled. "Give me the antidote." Ethan smirked, his tone almost mocking. "Oh, there's an antidote," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "But you'll have to earn it." Brian's stomach churned. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice cracking with desperation. Ethan leaned in, his eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. "Your life. If you want Sophie to live, you'll take your own life. And you'll do it in front of me." Brian's breath caught in his throat as the horrifying demand sank in. He had faced countless dangers in his career, but nothing had prepared him for this. For the first time, he truly understood what it felt like to be helpless. Ethan stepped back, straightening his jacket as if they'd just concluded a business deal. "You have 24 hours, he said, his voice steady. "Make your choice." As Ethan walked out of the infirmary, Brian sank into a chair, his head in his hands. For the first time, he didn't know what to do. At precisely the appointed hour, Ethan arrived at Brian's home. He was calm, composed, and detached, as if this were nothing more than a routine task. He carried a small vial of liquid, the antidote, but didn't offer it. Instead, he gestured for Brian to sit. "Where's Sophie?" Ethan asked, his voice void of emotion. "She's upstairs," Brian replied, his voice heavy with defeat. Ethan nodded. "Then let's get this over with. You know the terms." Brian hesitated, clutching the pistol tightly. His hand shook as he raised it, the barrel pointing toward his temple. He glanced at Ethan, hoping for a glimmer of mercy in his eyes, but found none. Ethan's face was a mask of cold satisfaction. "Wait," Brian said, his voice trembling. "How do I know you'll give her the antidote after I'm gone?" Ethan's lips curled into a smirk. "You don't. That's the beauty of it." Brian's heart sank. He realized there was no guarantee, no assurance that Sophie would survive even if he complied. He was trapped in Ethan's twisted game. Just as he began to pull the trigger, the door burst open with a loud bang. Margaret stood in the doorway, her frail figure trembling but her voice strong. "Stop!" she cried. Both men turned to look at her, stunned by her sudden appearance. Margaret held up a vial identical to Ethan's, her eyes locking onto Brian's. "This is the real antidote," she said firmly. "Ethan is lying to you. He doesn't care about saving your daughter." Brian lowered the pistol, confusion and hope flickering in his eyes. "What?" Ethan froze, his composure cracking for the first time. "Mom, what are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Margaret ignored him, stepping further into the room. Her hands trembled, but her resolve was unshaken. "Brian, I brought this because I won't let my son destroy 2 lives. Your daughter is innocent, just like I was. She doesn't deserve this." Ethan's face twisted with anger. "Innocent?" he spat. "She's the daughter of a man who left you to die. You're defending them after everything they've done to us?" Margaret turned to him, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not defending him. I'm stopping you. This isn't justice, Ethan. This is revenge, and it's killing you." Ethan took a step toward her, his fists clenched. "I don't care. They've looked down on us our whole lives, treated us like dirt. It's time they know what it feels like to suffer." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she shook her head. "I didn't raise you to be like this. You're not a monster, Ethan." The room fell silent for a moment, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Ethan's expression hardened. "You've betrayed me," he said coldly. "Fine, do whatever you want, but don't think this changes anything." He turned to leave, but Margaret's next words stopped him in his tracks. "I've already called the police." Ethan spun around, his face a mask of disbelief. "What?" "They're on their way," Margaret said, her voice steady. "You can't run from this." Fury flashed in Ethan's eyes as he lunged toward Margaret, reaching for the antidote. But Brian, now fully alert, reacted quickly. Years of training as a police officer kicked in, and he subdued Ethan with ease, pinning him to the ground. Margaret rushed to Sophie's side, administering the antidote with trembling hands. The room fell silent as they waited, every second dragging on like an eternity. Finally, Sophie's breathing steadied, her fever subsiding. Her small body stirred, and she opened her eyes weakly. "Daddy?" she whispered. Brian's eyes filled with tears as he knelt beside her. "I'm here, sweetheart," he said softly. The flashing lights of police cars illuminated the street outside Brian's house, casting long, flickering shadows across the living room. Inside, Margaret sat on the couch, her frail hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Ethan was handcuffed and restrained by two officers. Sophie rested upstairs, her breathing steady after the antidote had been administered. Brian stood silently near the doorway, watching the scene unfold with a storm of emotions brewing inside him. Anger, relief, guilt, all fought for dominance as he glanced at Margaret, then at Ethan. The weight of the night pressed heavily on everyone in the room. As the officers prepared to escort Ethan to the patrol car, Margaret stood up, her voice calm but firm. "Wait." The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at her. Ethan, his face a mix of anger and shame, avoided her gaze. Margaret stepped forward slowly, her frail body trembling but her resolve unbroken. "I need a moment with my son," she said softly. The officers hesitated, glancing at Brian, who gave them a brief nod. Ethan didn't lift his head as Margaret approached. "Ethan," she began, her voice steady despite the tears pooling in her eyes. "What you did tonight was wrong, not just to Sophie, but to yourself. This hatred you've carried, it's consumed you." Ethan clenched his jaw, his voice cold. "I did it for you, for the justice you never got." Margaret shook her head. "What you did wasn't justice. It was vengeance. And vengeance doesn't heal anything. It only destroys." Ethan finally looked at her, his hardened expression cracking slightly. "He left you to die," he said, his voice trembling with anger and pain. "He didn't care. Why should I?" Margaret placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "Because we are better than that. I didn't survive that day to watch you throw your life away. I want justice, yes, but not at the cost of your soul." Ethan stared at her, his anger faltering under the weight of her words. For a moment, the boy he used to be, the one who had always looked up to his mother, flickered in his eyes. But the bitterness still lingered, and he looked away. The officers led Ethan out, his head bowed. Margaret watched him go, tears streaming silently down her face. Brian stood frozen, torn between relief that his daughter was safe and guilt over his role in the events that had brought them to this point. Slowly, he approached Margaret, his steps hesitant. When she looked up at him, he dropped to his knees, the weight of his actions crushing him. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking, "for everything I did to you, for leaving you to suffer, for being the reason this happened." Margaret studied him for a long moment. She could see the remorse in his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped under the burden of his guilt. She took a deep breath, her voice calm but resolute. "What you did to me was cruel, Brian, but I saved your daughter because she is innocent. I saved her because I refuse to let hatred define me." Brian nodded, his head bowed. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make this right," he promised. Margaret didn't respond immediately. Instead, she placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of forgiveness, not for his sake, but for her own peace. The aftermath of the night rippled through everyone's lives. Ethan was charged with multiple crimes, including poisoning and attempted extortion. Though Margaret visited him in prison, their conversations were often tense, his bitterness not fully gone. Yet, she never gave up on him, hoping that time would soften his heart. Brian, true to his word, began to rebuild his life with a renewed sense of purpose. He resigned from his position as an officer, dedicating himself to community work and advocating for justice reform. He sought to undo the harm he had caused, driven by the memory of Margaret's forgiveness. Sophie recovered fully, her bright spirit untouched by the ordeal. She often asked about the nice lady who had saved her, and Brian always spoke of Margaret with the utmost respect. Margaret returned to her quiet life, but she carried the events of that night with her. Despite the pain, she found solace in knowing she had acted with compassion. She had faced hatred and refused to let it take root in her soul. Though the scars of injustice remained, she held on to hope that the world could change, one act of kindness at a time. Months turned into years, and the events of that fateful night became a distant memory for many, but not for Margaret. She often sat on her porch, her hands resting lightly on the arms of her wheelchair, gazing at the horizon as the sun set. The quiet rustle of leaves and the soft chirping of birds brought her a sense of peace. But her thoughts frequently wandered back to her son, Ethan, and the choices that had led them here. Ethan remained in prison, serving his sentence for the crimes he committed. Margaret visited him regularly, despite the tension that sometimes lingered between them. With each visit, she saw small changes in him, a softening of his hardened demeanor, a flicker of regret in his eyes. Though he rarely said it aloud, Margaret knew he was beginning to understand the weight of his actions. During one visit, Ethan finally spoke the words she had been waiting to hear. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was doing it for you, but I see now that I was wrong." Margaret reached across the table, her frail hand covering his. "I've already forgiven you, Ethan," she said. "What matters now is that you forgive yourself and find a way to move forward." Brian, too, had transformed. No longer an officer, he dedicated his life to serving others, working tirelessly in marginalized communities and advocating for justice reform. He often visited Margaret, bringing Sophie along with him. The little girl, now older, adored Margaret and would sit by her side for hours, listening to her stories and helping her tend to the small garden in her yard. One afternoon, as they sat together, Brian broke the silence. "I owe everything to you," he said, his voice sincere. "You didn't just save Sophie's life. You gave me a second chance to be a better man." Margaret smiled softly, her gaze steady. "People can change, Brian. It's not easy, but it's possible. What matters is that you use that chance to make a difference." He nodded, his heart heavy with gratitude. "I will. I promise." As time went on, Margaret's health declined. Yet, she never let the weight of her years dampen her spirit. She became a quiet symbol of resilience and compassion in her community, her story of forgiveness inspiring those who heard it. In her final days, Margaret reflected on the life she had lived. It had been filled with challenges, pain, and injustices, but also moments of profound love, growth, and redemption. She had faced hatred and cruelty, but had chosen compassion and forgiveness, not out of weakness, but out of strength. On a crisp autumn morning, much like the one that had set everything in motion, Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her community came together to honor her memory, sharing stories of the lives she had touched and the lessons she had taught. At her graveside, Ethan stood beside Brian and Sophie, his face solemn but his heart filled with determination. He placed a hand on the headstone, whispering a quiet promise. "I'll make you proud, Mom. I'll live the way you taught me to." Brian stood nearby, holding Sophie's hand. He looked at the headstone and then at Ethan. "We'll carry her legacy together," he said. Ethan nodded, a sense of purpose settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. Margaret's story didn't end with her. Her choices, her forgiveness, and her strength lived on in those she had touched. In Ethan's journey to redemption, in Brian's quest to make amends, and in Sophie's bright, unshaken spirit. Margaret's legacy continued to grow, a testament to the power of compassion and the enduring hope for a better world.